Γεια σας φίλοι του Δούρου Ήπου. Θα ακολουθεί μια μικρή συζήτηση με τον Jack Murphy, με τον οποίο σχολιάζουμε τα γεγονότα στην Ουκρανία. Ο Jack υπηρέτησε για 8 χρόνια στις ένοπλες δυνάμεις των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών και συγκεκριμένα στο 75ο Σύνταγμα Ranger και στο 5ο Special Forces Group. Επίσης είναι κάτοχος πτυχίου πολιτικών επιστημών από το Πανεπιστήμιο της Κολούμπια και αυτή τη στιγμή ζει και εργάζεται ως δημοσιογράφος επιστρατιωτικών θεμάτων. Hello Jack, pleasure to have you here with us today.
Hey Bill, how's it going, man?
All good, all good. So now we are day 28 on a war that very few believe that it will happen, and even, almost nobody believed that it will last that long. What's your take so far from what you have seen, and it's something you expected? Is something that subverted your expectations, or?
Definitely subverted my expectations, and I in fairness to me, because it's very important to be fair to me. I'm just kidding. But really though, I think it subverted the expectations of a lot of people who are far more intelligent than I am and much better studied on the subject of the Russian military, Russian politics, and Eastern Europe in general, right? So this has really come as a shock and a surprise to most people. None of us thought we would be here right now, right? That you're seeing a Ukrainian city turned into something that looks like Aleppo. But the Ukrainians are holding out. They have held out for a month here. The Russian military casualties are, as far as we can tell, we don't have authoritative data, but as far as we can tell, they're astronomical. Somewhere in the range of, the Russian newspaper accidentally published the figure 9,000 some odd soldiers dead. I think NATO's estimation was 40,000 dead, injured, or POW, or missing in action at this point in the war. That's catastrophic. That's unreal. Just the open source information, again, not authoritative data, but what we do have is we're seeing numbers of armored vehicles being destroyed each day that equal like an armored brigade. It's absolutely insane. This is a war of attrition, and the Ukrainian military and government is probably on shakier ground than any of us would like to admit. Much more so than the war propaganda would have us know. Which we understand, of course, the Ukrainians are fighting for their survival, so they're going to, they're going to lowball their numbers and overestimate the Russian numbers. The Russians are going to do the exact opposite, right? That's just how it works. But I think we have to be cautious in that sense that the Ukrainians are probably on shakier ground than any of us would like to admit. But they are resisting and they are fighting back. And what we've seen amazingly yesterday was them pushing the Russians out of a suburb outside Kiev. They're actually fighting back effectively. And this isn't like a complete rollback of Russian gains by any measure. But we are seeing them fight back. And what was the other situation, Bill, that we had talked about yesterday where it appeared that they had encircled some Russian formations?
Yeah, apparently it's the suburb you mentioned. Apparently there is some kind of encirclement going on in Hostomel, Irpin, and Bucha, which is like 3 little towns/villages outside of Kyiv.
Did you see the BBC report that was done on that little village that repelled like a Russian tank? I don't know if it was a brigade or a platoon, but it was a sizable military formation. And the shopkeepers and the grandmas came out with NLAWs, and they set up roadblocks and funneled or channelized, is like the doctrinal term, channelized the enemy into an ambush, blew up a bridge to divert them in another direction, and then just ambushed them with these NLAWs and with hunting rifles. And destroyed this entire armored column. It's absolutely insane. I don't think any of us expected it to be like this.
Which is, those guys apparently, the town was part of what the Ukrainians call the territorial force, which is like locals, formed in a unit. Which proves the point of, I guess it makes a lot of points about the, setup of such units in countries that they are smaller and they don't have, the resources to have a large standing army like the US, for example. Which brings us, you made an interesting point. You said the Ukrainians are on a shakier ground that we would like to admit. You think the West lives in a kind of bubble as far as the capabilities or the losses of the Ukrainians so far and how far they are able to go on that?
Well, we likewise have not seen, in my opinion, authoritative numbers of the Ukrainian losses either. We've seen some estimates, but it's not entirely clear. I think that it's quite possible that in the Western world that it's very easy for us to act as cheerleaders from a distance. We want to support the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian people, but it's very easy for us to create our own little echo chambers on social media and, believe that this is, that it's like Red Dawn in Ukraine. But it could be, the Ukrainians, of course, are paying an astronomical price for all of this. They're the ones who are really suffering. You have millions of people being displaced, cities being destroyed, soldiers being killed. And I'm not saying that, the Ukrainian government is about to collapse or anything like that. I'm just saying let's not overestimate, how well this war is going. It's unclear how long they can hold out, but at the same time, I was one of those people. I thought 48 to 72 hours and this war would be over, right? That the Russians would just engulf the entire country. That clearly has not happened. So I've been wrong before, and I would be happily wrong on this. I think that as this thing has gone on, what has emerged is this most amazing prospect that actually the Ukrainians could win this. That maybe there is a possibility that they could roll the Russians back and regain their territory. It's amazing to think about. I mean, this is a beleaguered democratic country in Eastern Europe being overwhelmed by a tyrant, by an authoritarian system and government. And I don't necessarily have any problem with Russian soldiers aside from the fact that they're in Ukraine. If they do a 180, turn right back the way they came, and go back to Russia, that's fine. But you are seeing a resistance. You're seeing the underdog fight back and be successful at it. So I mean, you're really seeing the history books being written right before our eyes, and it is amazing to see. And I'm sorry, I can't help but being a little bit of a cheerleader. I'm happy to see them win.
And I think the fact that civilians are fighting, but it warms your Green Beret heart, right?
Yeah, and that there's a couple of things that you can maybe derive from that. I mean, one of them is that again, the Ukrainian military may be in worse shape than we think, that civilians are having to pick up weapons and fight alongside territorials or professional soldiers. But at the same time, I mean, God bless them. They're doing what they have to do to fight and sacrifice for their country. That you're seeing the civilians stand up and do that. It is the total, right? The from the Swiss manual, the total resistance model, the one that NATO has gone back and looked at as they prepared for this fight over the last decade. So is it paying dividends? I think so. I think this demonstrates that having a partnership with our various partner forces around the world is worthwhile. I think that in the case of the Ukrainians, we clearly found a viable partner force. We've had difficulties finding viable partner forces in other parts of the world, but here in Ukraine, it seems to have worked. It worked quite effectively.
Sorry, in the current situation, because we see those attacks in supply lines and all that, and usually are conducted either by civilians or by territorials that they have stayed behind, or by Ukrainian SOF. Do you think that's going to be the strategy that's going to pay the most, or they have to move to something else? I mean, supply lines, tanks. What is the best option here for the Ukrainian army?
I mean, the Ukrainian military, I mean, clearly we've already seen that they are not going like toe to toe in like massive tank battles, right? It's not like artillery battles either, where you're seeing like a battery fires and then they fire the counter battery. Or some of these other kind of like Cold War ideas we had about what war would look like here. The Ukrainians are already using a sort of irregular warfare or unconventional warfare approach, using small teams, going out with anti-tank weapons, and sometimes anti-aircraft weapons. They're, of course, the fact that so many of them are recorded with aerial drones and like HD camera footage. I mean, they're putting a lot of emphasis on the propaganda aspect of these attacks, which is smart of them. It works as a force multiplier for them in so many ways. Um, but as far as tactics, I mean, I think the Russians keep fucking up, and they have not shown any sort of like military Darwinism. They haven't shown us that they're learning or adapting as of yet. So I think as long as that remains the case, I mean, you're not going to interrupt your enemy while they're making a mistake, right? So as long as the current tactics they're using, kind of, doing these ambushes with anti-tank weapons are working for them, they can, and I imagine they will continue to go on, because of the large numbers of armored vehicles that they are destroying every day. I mean, it is a war of attrition, and it's a question of how much longer the Russian military is going to keep funneling war material into a failed strategy. We're already seeing these indications that the next big thing for them is they've already sent Chechens. Oh, now they're going to send Arabs. They're going to send like Syrians, or like there's rumors about sending Yemenis and things like. Okay, guy, let's see how that goes, right? The Russian military is getting their ass whooped. You're going to send a bunch of, believe me, the Syrian military is not in great shape either.
So I have two questions that they follow each other. So all these weapons we mentioned, the NLAWs, the javelins, are the overt Western help. You have some information about the covert Western help, though, which you're also going to develop in the Team House. Anybody that wants to hear that details, guys, Friday or Saturday this episode?
Friday, and I mean, people can go out and read some of the articles. They were not written by me; they were written by my friend Zach Dorfman, who's a journalist that we're going to interview on our podcast this Friday. He wrote a few articles folks can go and read right now on Yahoo News about the covert aspects, and mostly what he's written about is the stay behinds, essentially, that the CIA stood up a number of programs. Before the war happened, they sent small numbers of ground branch and special activities division people out to the front lines to examine the Russian TTPs and to help the Ukrainians subvert them, and taught them tactics, clandestine communication, how to screen their signature and not be targeted by the Russians, how to use anti-tank weapons, how to use sniper weapons, sniper systems. Giving them all sorts of training. This included bringing some of these guys were brought to the United States to be trained in a secret facility here in the States and then sent back to Ukraine. So that program, as far as I understand, it's defunct in the sense that it happened. This training took place, and now those guys are in action, doing what they were trained to do. And again, it seems like they're doing it quite effectively. There are a couple of different agency programs that are ongoing right now that I won't get too deep into. I will just say there have been since day one contractors on the ground. I don't know that there are any actual CIA officers, but there have been contractors on the ground, not in combat, not fighting, but behind the scenes advising and facilitating, the intelligence sharing and all that sort of stuff that, you would expect and hope that we would be doing. So that's about as far as I would get into with that.
Of course. Anybody wants more details? The Team House this Friday with Jack and Dave Park, sorry. So the modern weapons you provide, do you think a weapon system like the Javelin, it makes it easier for somebody to train on, given the fact that it's having some features like a fire and forget and all that? Do you think it will be easier for somebody to pick up?
Yeah, I do. As I recall, the Javelin manual, like user manual, was rather thin. It's not a particularly complicated system. Like, let's say, like sniper operations, that it's pretty complicated. You have to teach people how to do range estimation, wind estimation, and compensate for all of these different frictions. There's some math you have to do. There are shortcuts you learn along the way, right? But let's say the Special Forces sniper course is like 8 weeks long. I think the conventional Army sniper course is 4 or 5 weeks long. And that's how long it takes to train a sniper. It's a good amount of time, and that's just like your basic training. Afterwards, you have to continue and sustain these skills. So I just use that as an example. I mean, it takes a pretty big investment in the soldier to teach them how to do that. To fire the javelin, you can teach someone to do that in a day. There's a trainer, a remote trainer, and it's just an inert javelin system that connects up to a computer that's running some programming on it. And you can run simulations on the javelin where the soldier will actually be looking through the control unit, the clue. And I mean, I did this when I went through special forces training, and there'll be all kinds of vehicles, you know, in this
passing by,
driving around, and even helicopters that you can shoot at. So I think you could train, you could train a soldier to use the javelin in one day. Obviously a few days would be preferable. And then you'd also like to, if possible, train the guys how to use, and this is getting into a whole other branch, a whole other topic that maybe we don't want to go into right now, but how much American anti-tank doctrine do we want to teach them? Are we trying to train anti-tank sections that's going to fight and behave as a section? Or are we trying to teach essentially guerrilla fighters that are going to go behind the lines in onesies and twosies and fire a couple javelins off at a tank brigade and then get the hell out of there before they get attacked? So it depends on, you're going to train them to do whatever it is you want them to do on those specific tasks, especially during the war itself, when you're going to have a limited amount of time to train them. So I suspect that's probably the approach right now.
You mentioned before the Syrians, because obviously that's a big thing, because it came out of official Russian sources. They asked for help from, and they will pay mercenaries. Besides their like proficiency as soldiers, what other difficulties you will assume a unit from Syria will face in an environment like Ukraine?
Well, there are a number. I mean, I think a lot of this is more, it's more about public relations for the Kremlin, right? It's sort of like George Bush's coalition of the willing, famously lampooned by Dave Chappelle, who, you know, is saying, we got Luxembourg, we got the Zulu nations, you know, we got...
I don't see a mission accomplished banner on the end of that, though.
But what I'm getting at is that I think Putin is trying to make it appear that he has a coalition of the willing, that he has global support, and he'll do that by trying to wrangle up the Syrians and the Belarusian military. There's a rumor about Yemenis being brought in. He was asking what the Chinese were going to provide, like MREs, like military rations. So you can see these sort of like tepid, you know, flaccid attempts as he tries to develop this sort of like international coalition of people who don't give a fuck, right? And sending the Syrians in there, I mean, first off, it'll be interesting to see what numbers of Syrian soldiers actually hit the ground in Ukraine. Is it going to be hundreds? Is it going to be thousands? And I mean, let's talk about a shaky military and a shaky government. I mean, Syria is not in good shape. I mean, I haven't been there in a while, but I mean, the country is still fragmented with, you know, a dozen different factions vying for control of it. So, I mean, when we talk about the Syrian military, we're probably really talking about Syrian militias that they're going to take off the streets of Damascus or, you know, Homs or wherever the hell they are now, and put them on a Russian airplane and fly them over there, and then deploy them into Ukrainian cities. So you're going to deploy foreigners who don't understand the terrain, don't understand the language, and have next to no military training. Like, beyond guarding a checkpoint on the road, like, these guys, their ability to conduct anything resembling like maneuver warfare, infantry tactics, mechanized infantry tactics, like that, that's just not going to happen. They're not even remotely equipped to do that.
I think I have some. Give me a second. Okay, yeah, I have some very specific and more spicy questions in the sense.
Okay.
As a level, as a professional soldier, you mentioned that before, but I just wanted a bit of a you know, to expand on that. How you judge the Ukrainians as partner force, as you said, because you mentioned we didn't have compared to Afghanis or Iraqis.
You mean why I think they're a viable partner for us?
Yes, I mean, you mentioned it, but I just wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, we go around the world and we've been fighting counterinsurgencies, especially for the last 20 years, or other sorts of unconventional campaigns. And in order to do that, we've attempted to work by, with, and through partner forces. And I mean, this is like, there's a lot of different thought that goes into that. Lessons derived from, the battle for Algiers and Lawrence of Arabia, and our thoughts, the British approach of using proxies to conduct that kind of guerrilla warfare. There's all kinds of doctrinal thought behind it that we can go into another time, but we have attempted to use that tactic around the world, and sometimes it works quite well, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the problem is that we want to go into a part of the world and we look for a partner force, and there just isn't a viable partner force, and there can be a lot of different reasons for that. Sometimes we go into countries and we start from the assumption that the insurgents are illegitimate and the government we're trying to help is legitimate. That's a big assumption, and a lot of times the local people do not see it that way. Sometimes we go into places like Afghanistan, for instance. There wasn't necessarily a viable partner force. You could just buy off warlords. We attempted to create a viable partner force, which was the various Afghan special operations units. To some extent, same situation in Iraq. In both cases, we had the problem that we did, over the course of many years, create a good partner force. But as long as the host nation government is completely corrupt and and basically just shoving dollar bills into their pockets, so they can go live in exile in Sweden, you're kind of pissing in the wind by developing those kinds of units. And we saw that when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, and when ISIS took over Iraq, and these highly motivated soldiers we trained were just left in the wind because they didn't have ammo or water or fuel or anything else they needed to fight. In Syria, another interesting case study. We came into the game fairly late, when there wasn't necessarily any sort of viable partner force at the time, other than the Kurds, which we molded into the Syrian Democratic Forces, and we used them in tandem with Arab militias to fight even further south into non-Kurdish areas. Very interesting situation there. But when it came to like the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, and other different iterations of that, we attempted, like the New Syrian Army was another one, just a total boondoggle. We were taking illiterate, dirt farmers, essentially, people who had no motivation to fight, and we were trying to train them into like American soldiers using American doctrine. Giving them like gun trucks, and they're going to do this sort of motorized infantry operations across the desert. And it's all rather silly. I mean, when we do that, we try to create a mirror image of ourselves rather than looking at the culture as it is and kind of using that culture as a conduit to mold the guerrilla fighters that we're trying to create into a certain direction. Like in Syria, it would have been far more effective, in my opinion, to train assassins and saboteurs than it would have been to try to train, like an infantry platoon in the American model.
So,
That was just not going to happen.
so essentially, you're going for the Lawrence of Arabia approach, that he
Yeah.
just led the guys, didn't do anything.
And well, yeah, you're going to look at like with the Kurds, they have their own training processes. They have their own culture, their own doctrine. Why are we going to mess with something that doesn't, I mean, it's not necessarily bad, right? We're just going to look at it and then say, okay, let's use these processes. And on top of that, I'm also going to train you to use this new weapon system, or, hey, in addition to that, I'm also going to show you this other little thing. We're going to give you some medical training, and, you start moving things incrementally here and there, just kind of showing them the right way, and teaching them the specific tasks that you want them to do. In Ukraine, it's a very different situation. That we had a government there. Okay, the Ukrainian government historically has been a bit of a basket case, right? I think the World Bank has said Ukraine's like one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It has its problems, right? But when they're being invaded by an outside country, and now the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian system skyrockets in the eyes of the people, right? They certainly do not want to live under the thumb of a foreign dictator, right?
For sure.
So the Ukrainian government in this case has all of the legitimacy. The opposing force has no legitimacy at all. So we have that going in our favor as far as finding a partner for us. And then there was already a Ukrainian military. Okay, it had some problems. It definitely was born out of the Soviet model. But a lot of work had been done by the United States and also by NATO. Many different NATO countries going in there and helping out over the course of the last 8 years and attempting to modernize them and bring them up to date and teach them new tactics and give them new weapon systems to use. There's a lot of hard work that was put in there, and not just special ops or CIA, like conventional military units going in there and training the Ukrainian military. The Office of Defense Cooperation, there's nothing secret squirrel about it. A very conventional, open. Every embassy has a Office of Defense Cooperation. They facilitated all those American arms transfers to Ukraine. All of those sorts of things really paid dividends here. And I think those are a lot of the reasons why I don't want to take anything away from the Ukrainians. They're the ones who are fighting and paying the price. But from this is a very American perspective, I think this is why we were able to find a viable partner force in Ukraine.
Because you mentioned, I'm asking because you mentioned culture, and you said about Syrians, it will be easier to train them as assassins or saboteurs. It's easier when there is actually an army that you can actually just tweak around. Instead, you're following the Eastern model. Let's teach you the Western model. It's easier to create them, as you said, in your image.
Yeah, I mean, that's something Americans do. We want to do all over the world. Is kind of create mirror images of ourselves. And I think, yeah, you're probably right there that the Ukrainians were already closer to ourselves too. So it wasn't so difficult to kind of bring them up to NATO standards or something approaching NATO standards, right?
So, and the other question, let's delve into the hypothetical here. How do you see this whole thing ends? There is an off-ramp for Putin. Putin stays in power. I mean, like, just everything is in the air. Obviously, that's my assumption. Yeah. But
I hate to make predictions. I have been not very good at them on this particular conflict. I think Putin being like overthrown in a coup or something like that is maybe wishful thinking. It's almost fantastical. But the way things are going and how badly this war is going, I mean, I think we do have to prepare for any of these eventualities. I mean, if it does get to that point, like, what if the Ukrainians win too good? They win too much, and it actually destabilizes the Russian government. That would be the most dangerous part of this entire conflict, because now we have to somehow manage the transition of the Russian government from President Putin to whatever it's going to have next. And this is a rather large nuclear power. That's a pretty frightening scenario, and we don't have a very good track record in transitioning governments to democracies, right? It's not something we've shown ourselves to be very good at. But I don't know. That might be a fantastical scenario. What are some scenarios that are more realistic? Maybe the Russians are continue to fight this thing, and through brute force and war crimes and devastation, they end up partitioning Ukraine in half. And Zelensky and whatever's left of the government, it feels like they're forced to negotiate a peace treaty of some kind and give up half of their country. Maybe that's one scenario. It's one that I've heard. Maybe the Ukrainians are able to repel the Russians back to, or keep them where they're at now. They probably control like maybe a tenth of the country.
Yeah, something like
that. And that's where the new border is drawn. Maybe they're able to repel them back to just the little parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, or, best case scenario, maybe we just keep pouring javelins into this and the Ukrainians keep fighting, and maybe we push Russia all the way out. But I mean, this is already such a humiliation for Putin. I mean, no matter how this ends, I think he's going to have to change the goalposts and declare mission accomplished. you know, whatever that is,
Yeah.
whatever bit of Ukraine he's able to claim and say, well, we accomplished our strategic goals here, you know, and there's no need to punish the Ukrainian people any further. And yeah, you'll get that
Yeah.
mission accomplished banner on the aircraft carrier and all of that.
Well, the aircraft carrier is not working, as you know. It's usually on fire.
Is it in dry dock, really?
I mean, the Kuchenov, I think is the name. I think again
Yeah,
it
yeah.
had some problems. I mean, I don't know. With that aircraft carrier, it's very strange.
So yeah, there's a number of different scenarios that could play out here, and yeah, people keep talking about, oh, we need to find off ramps for Putin, and I kind of disagree in the sense that, I mean, I think when Putin wants to throw the towel in the ring and say I quit, you're like, yes, okay, we should give him that, right, and say, okay, turn your forces back around, head back the way you came, and we'll call it quits, okay. But it's not our job to write Russia's foreign policy. They've been writing their own. They got themselves into this goddamn mess, and it's their job to find their own off ramp. My point of view is that their off ramp is strategic military defeat in Ukraine. Right now, the Russians are showing weakness. They are more vulnerable than they've ever been in any of our lifetimes. This is a moment that, you know, maybe we won't see for the another century. So, from my point of view, this is the time to knock them down a peg. And again, I'm sorry to sound callous about it because I know there's a lot of people dying here. But the thing is, we don't want to have to fight this war again in 10 years, in another 8 years, or another 10 years. I mean, if the Ukrainians give up a tenth of their country or they give up 50% of the country and we negotiate peace or whatever, look, Putin's just going to rebuild his forces and do this shit again in another decade. Do we really want to fight this war a second time? I'd say no. Let's make this a decisive military victory for the Ukrainians and end this thing once and for all and knock the Russians back another 35 years.
And somebody might argue that if you, I mean, and when I mean you, we, the Western world, I assume, fight this war in 10 years, there might be another player joining the game.
It's impossible to predict that far ahead, right? You never know. Yeah. Well, you have a different sort of Eurasian coalition. I'm skeptical that they keep talking about it. I'm skeptical that they're able to put together some sort of like pan-Eurasian partnership, military partnership. But in another 10, 20 years, maybe. You don't know.
Okay, I mean, I think I completed my questions. I don't want to hold you much longer. I mean, we did 32 minutes.
Yeah.
Again, thank you very much for being here, Jack. Guys, anybody wants more information about what JSOC and other Secret Squirrel organizations are doing in Ukraine, the Team House this Friday with Jack and Dave Park. Thank you very much, Jack.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Appreciate it.